Hey guitarists, so today we're going to talk about 50 watts and 100 watts. Which one is better and which one fits your needs? I have had many years of experience owning both. I've owned about over 50 heads that were tube heads, and I've played them all. So I think my opinion is a little valid, and I've also been playing shows with 50 watts and 100 watt heads. And my band Lies Behind Your Eyes, you can all check that down below. But anyways, I wanted to talk to you guys about which one do I think is better and which one is going to fit your needs better. So first off, let's go ahead and I'm going to actually show you what I have right now just as a quick, just to show you some gear. Here we go. What I use for practice, I actually just use my little Yamaha and I use my 100 watt MG solid state head. That's just what I use for quick practice. So I have a JCM 800 100 watt, I have a 120 watt 6505 PV, I have a 50 watt EVH 5150, a Hewden Kettner Triumph Mark II that is splittable between 50 watts and 100 watts. This is a Hewden Kettner Warp X that's 100 watts, and below it I have a Mesa Roadster which is also splittable between 50 watts and 100 watts. This is my Bogner Alchemist that is 20 watts and 40 watts splittable. And this is my Bogner Alchemist that is 20 watts and 40 watts splittable. This is my Bad Cat Cougar 50. This is a 50 watt tube head. So this is my current live rig right now. I have a Mesa Dual rectifier, which is the rack mount one, which is 100 watts, and then below I have a Marshall JVM 210H, which is also 100 watts. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the pros and cons of both 50 watt and 100 watts. I wrote this on a clipboard, but my handwriting's really bad, so I'm just going to read it to you. But we're going to start off with 50 watts. What is the pros of 50 watts? One, tends to be a lot lighter. They don't have as much mechanics and as much hardware, so they do tend to be lighter. They are easier to max out, and when I mean max out is the volume. You get a lot more and easier saturation with a 50 watt because you have to crank it and there's only 50 watts. You tend to get the saturation that you want without really needing a pedal. Sometimes you can use a pedal with 50 watts as well to reach the saturation you want, but 50 watts is just easier to get that. The other thing is they tend to be a little bit cheaper because obviously less materials, and that is something else that is a pro about them. And the fourth one that I have is less tubes. Less tubes, less money. Do you need 100 watts? You don't need 100 watts. But I'm going to tell you the pros and cons of that one in a second. The cons now, they tend to not have as much bottom end. And when I mean bottom end, I mean that low girth of just boom, boom, whenever you chug. They still have bottom end. They're still thick, but they're just not as big. They don't have as much bass as much. And then the last one I have is not as much clean headroom. Clean headroom is very important to me, and whenever I'm on the clean channel on a 50 watt, whenever I crank it up like halfway, I can start feeling it break up on 50 watts. It breaks up, and it's in a nice tone, but like if you wanted the cleanest of clean, 100 watts, you'll have enough volume to where you can put it up halfway and you still usually get good cleans, depending on your amp. But I know like a Mesa or my Hewden Kettner, at 100 watts, the cleans just sound huge and beautiful. All right, so 100 watts. The pros, more low end. They tend to have, like I said, more low end. Another one is more headroom. If you wanted the clean headroom, like I was just saying before, it has more headroom. Overall, it is a little bit louder, but not by a lot. And I'm going to explain that in a bit too. But now the cons. They are heavy. They are very heavy. They can go at range I don't even know, but like to the point where like if I have muscles, it's because I've been lifting tube heads so much. More tubes is a con because it's going to cost you more money. And they are hard to reach the saturation, the sweet saturation spot, which usually they tend to just use an overdrive pedal in front of them, like to boost the amp, so to speak, boost the amp. But they are just harder to reach the very like overdrive sound coming from the tube head because you have to crank your amp in order for it to get that tone. So that's why. So something I get a lot of that I wanted to clarify is a lot of people think 50 watts is loud and 100 watts is twice as loud. Now, this with tube heads, that is not actually true. How it works is I drew this graph to basically show you. It's a really crappy graph. Give me a break. But this is 50 watts. This is 100 watts. They are not that much difference in loudness. But like right here, the first line is eardrum level. That is where your ears cannot handle it. It's too freaking loud. It's damaging your hearing like just beyond, okay? So a 50 watt is already loud. Right here, right above that line is drums, acoustic drums. If you have a hard hitting drummer like I do, it's loud. It's very loud. This is where the drums are. You can actually achieve overtaking the drums with a 50 watt head. Now this does depend if you're using a 212 and a 412, but overall, if I'm using a 412, usually, if I'm using a 412 with a 50 watt amp, I can overtake the drummer where I'm actually too loud. Now, of course, that depends on the amps, because I know some amps are 50 watts and others are also 50 watts, and one's a little bit louder than the other, but it's not by a lot. They just round it off to the nearest. But this is something that I've always wanted to clarify, because a lot of people think you need a 100 watt head because it's the best. I don't believe a 100 watt is the best. I believe that they both have different needs for what you want. That's why I own both. But I do tend to go to the 100 watts because they have more girth and more low end and more headroom, and I can boost that with my pedal. Now with a 50 watt, if I wanted more girth, I could use an EQ, but it tends to make everything muddy and it's just a lot of inconvenience. But what I do like 50 watts for is I think of them as dirt bikes. Like, they're not the fastest, biggest bike on the road, but when you crank it, they go to full potential, but they're good. They're still fast. They accelerate really fast. That's how I think of a 50 watt head. It's very it's there to work, and it's a workhorse. And 100 watts, like, you barely end up using all of it. And I like it because even at low volumes, it's just the low end that you get. And it is kind of weird too, because like I have a PV6505 that I don't have to crank loud at all, and it sounds pretty bad when you start cranking it higher than like say 7 on the volume, and it's 120 watts. And then there are some 50 watt heads that, this is something else that I've always wanted to talk about too. There are heads out there that when you crank them more than halfway, they sound like absolute shit. Perfect example, my EVH 5150, the white head that I showed you guys, if you crank that all the way up to halfway, it sounds great. You crank it any more than halfway, for some reason, it just is way too much. You got to turn the gain like almost all the way down just to get the oversaturated sound that you want. Ryan Bruce or whatever, he posted a video the other day, and his gain was literally at 3 o'clock with the EVH 5150. But I noticed whenever I played live, I had it up halfway and it was too much. It was already too loud for a 212. I got told to turn down my 212 amp with my 50 watt head because I was too loud, and that was at half volume of my 5150 EVH3, the 50 watt head. So that is something to keep into consideration, that even venues, even big venues that I've played, they're going to mic your amp regardless. So as long as you get the tone that you want, it doesn't matter how loud your speakers are on stage, they're going to mic it regardless. So I tend to use 100 watts right now just because I like that big, thick girth, and they tend to have like a little bit of like looseness because they're bigger. To me, it's just something that I've been experimenting with, but I love 50 watt heads, like I said, with the whole dirt bike thing. But that's something that I've always wanted to clarify. Everyone thinks that 100 watts is better, and it's really not. It's all personal preference, and like I said, like I've owned both, and like if you go out and own both, like yeah, it's then you can see exactly what I'm talking about. They're not as much louder, and like I said too, there are some tube heads where they don't sound good cranked all the way up. That is just them. Another example that I've had is I've owned a 30 watt Orange TH30, and I cranked it all the way up and it sounded beautiful. And it honestly sounded its best being all the way cranked up. Some tube heads are awesome and they work like that. Some do not. My Mesa Roadster Dual sounded amazing cranked all the way up. It was so loud though. That was when we were doing our music video, Eyes Open Wide, and I cranked it all the way up in an airplane hangar, and it was loud. It was so loud. But anyways, I hope this helps you guys kind of decide what you guys want. I will probably be making a video in the future about the tube heads and Kempers, and why is everyone going to Kempers, and why does a lot of people stay into tube heads. I'm personally staying tube head, and I can explain that in another video. But anyways, I hope you guys have an awesome day, and you can follow my Instagram, Eric Shreds. Peace out.